It's a California legend. Some young actor or young actress takes a bus to the Golden State, and then they get discovered by some mega producer or famous director. And suddenly they're cast in tons of films, and they have more wealth and fame than they ever could have imagined before. And we look at someone who lived that story and we say to ourselves, that's a good life. But is it? Is it a good life? Because a number of celebrities have actually gone on record in a very candid way by saying, like, they're kind of miserable even with all their wealth and their fame. Jesus once said that if you want to find your life, you have to lose it. What did he mean by that? The first Christians understood that their happiness and a life of fulfillment wasn't tied to wealth and to fame, rather to understanding there are separate lessons you have to learn at different stages of life in order to give your life away. So let's explore what those lessons are, and let's discover what it actually looks like to live a good life.
Good morning. Are we awake? Okay, a third of you. I'll take it, actually. At 10:02, I was in the back. I was like, there are 4 people here. By 10:10, the rest of you came. Thanks for being on time. I know, it's the first Sunday of the year, whatever. Okay, so we're starting a new series today called The Good Life. I want to start off by telling you a quick story about 2 people. Most of us, throughout the course of our life, have met some elderly people who are inspiring, and we've met some others who are kind of like cautionary tales, right? And so when I was a pastor of a church in Pennsylvania a number of years ago, there were 2 gentlemen I want to talk to you about today. One we'll call Dave because his name was Dave. The other we'll call Steve because that's not his name, but I don't want to tell you his real name because I don't have as many kind things to say about Steve. Okay, so let's say Dave and Steve, they were both over the age of 75. And the church that I pastored in Pennsylvania, we had 2 different auditoriums that met for worship at the same time. And then we had a video stream of the sermon that went between the 2. So one auditorium had a more traditional service. So it was like, a choir and horns and that kind of thing. And the other was more contemporary, more like what we do here at vervecity Church. And those were both happening at the same time. So they had done this years ago. They'd set that up years ago, and the hope was that people with different worship preferences could still worship at the same church, kind of under the same roof. That was the idea. Lots of good came out of that. One of the downsides, though, right, every time you do something, there's always unintended consequences. One of the downsides was, as you can imagine, just a little bit of tribalism developed between the 2 groups, right? We always had to make sure that everybody was even, or sometimes people would get upset. So this person who we'll call Steve, one Sunday, there was some special creamer that was going to go in the coffees that was put in the lobbies of each room, but they forgot to put it in the traditional service lobby. So it was just over in the contemporary service. And Steve got really mad about that. Steve was the kind of person, by the way, every time I talked to him, he was upset about something. Somebody had not treated him properly. Someone had disrespected him. He was like Rodney Dangerfield, but not funny, right? Like he was that kind of thing, like, get no respect. Like, so that was Steve. And then that Sunday when the creamer wasn't put over here, he came over to the contemporary side of the building, and he brought a basket with him, and he took the creamer and put all of it in the basket and ran it back to the other side of the building. And as he went, he yelled out, "This is BS," but he did not shorten it, okay? Like, in church. All right, so that's Steve. There's another person about the same age who was also in that same service. His name is Dave. And Dave was one of the most unflappable, one of the kindest, one of the most wise people I've ever met in my life. And I remember I used to meet with Dave once a month or so and just like bounce things off of him. He'd led a lot of amazing things in his life, and so I just looked to him for wisdom. And I remember early on, I was struggling with some relational challenges within the church. Every church has relational challenges. I know you think, surely not this church. Every church has relational challenges because wherever 2 or more people are gathered in Jesus' name, Jesus is there, and also relational challenges. Because that's what people, right? People are people, and we struggle. Like, we're always having to figure out, like, how do I lay my own ego down in order to support the other? And that's just always a challenge for any of us. So there were some relational challenges that I was trying to navigate. And I remember sitting down with Dave and just telling him, like, look, this is exhausting to me. And this is not why I got into ministry, right? I got into ministry because I believed that the church was the hope of the world. I wanted to connect people with Jesus Christ. And I find myself trying to, like, navigate and officiate all these relational challenges. And it's just ridiculous. And he said, Josh, he kind of chuckled to himself and smiled. Unflappable, right? He said, Josh, you're a leader, which means you have to navigate relational challenges. So you can either identify that that's part of what leaders do and then do it well, or you can pretend that that's not what part of leaders do and you can do it really poorly and get crushed. It's up to you. And he just kind of stepped back and smiled at me. What a jerk. But he was like that all the time. I would bring him, when we'd meet, I'd bring to him a host of problems, a host of issues, and he would always start off the same way. He would chuckle a little bit to himself, and he'd say, well, that's just a problem you'll have to solve. And then he started asking me questions. Hey, what would happen if you did this? What would happen if you did that, right? He wouldn't tell me what to do. He never assumed that he had enough information to know for sure the exact thing to do. He would start to dialogue with me and to pull me into it. He cared about me. And he cared about me leading well because he cared about me. And so that was just a totally, I hope that I arrive at the place that Dave arrived at by the time that I am Dave's age. He was inspiring, right? Steve was, not all bad, but certainly a lot of his life didn't demonstrate the fruits of the Spirit of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control that Jesus invites us into. But Dave's did. And so for many of us, we're asking the question, what does it look like to live a good life? How do I, as an older person, when I get there, maybe some of us are there already, how do I, as an older person, be the kind of person that inspires rather than the kind that serves as a cautionary tale? Right? It's a new year, and a lot of times, churches will kind of do this New Year, New You type of series where we talk about things like life hacks or shortcuts or whatever, like little tips you can do to do better this year. What I want to do in this series is actually talk about what does it look like to live a good life for the long haul? What does it look like to live in such a way now that by the time you're 10, 20, 30, 40 plus years down the road, you feel like, man, that was a life worth living. That was a good life. And so that's what this series really is about. We're going to start then in this series by looking at Jesus, because here at vervecity.church, we believe that if you want to talk about a good life, Jesus has to be the foundation, the starting place for the life that you actually live. This is what Jesus says in John chapter 10. We're going to look at verses 8 through 11. He says, all who came before me were thieves and robbers. And he's talking about here those people who came before him that claimed to point the way to God, but didn't point to the Messiah, the Savior, who Jesus was, right? Like they were leading people astray. So therefore, they're robbing the joy and the journey of other people. All who came before me were thieves and robbers. But the true sheep did not listen to them. Yes, I am the gate, he says. Those who come in through me will be saved. They will come and go freely, and they will find good pastures. The thief's purpose is to steal and kill and destroy. But my purpose, what is the purpose of Jesus? My purpose is to give them a rich and satisfying life. If you want to have a rich and satisfying life, Jesus says, look no further than him. That's the starting place. And it matters so much to him. He says, I'm the good shepherd. The good shepherd sacrifices his life for the sheep. He cares so much about you, and he cares so much about the life that you live, the life that you lead, that he was willing to lay down his own in order that you could have a good and satisfying life. That's the message of the Gospels. That's the message of Jesus, which means that a good life starts with Jesus. That's where it starts. So what I want to do for our time today is to talk about the two halves of life. We'll look more at some additional scriptural background and all that kind of stuff later in this service and later in the next several weeks. But basically what we see over and over and over in the Gospels is that there are two halves of life. And David Brooks, a couple of years ago, he's a writer, he wrote a book called The Two Mountains. And he basically, his idea is that you can kind of refer to each half of life as a mountain that you climb. And so what do the two mountains look like? Because the first mountain looks very different from the second. The first mountain is the one that we think we're supposed to climb, and then at some point in our life, usually trouble comes along or something happens and we get blown off that mountain only to discover, oh, there's a second mountain that's where I should have been climbing all along. But you can't get to the second mountain without climbing the first mountain first. And none of that probably makes sense yet, so let's talk about what we're talking about. Would that be helpful? Sure. Okay, so two mountains. Here's the first one. This is what we spend the majority of our childhood and our young adulthood, even often into middle age, trying to climb. This is the first mountain. The first mountain is about establishing an identity. Who am I? What is it that makes me unique? Who am I? So establishing an identity. Or leaving your parents, right? Some of us do this better than others. It's the idea that at some point you need to actually leave your home, leave your parents. Now, this is not just because you respect your parents and you'd like for them to live into retirement without having to care for you every single day of the week, right? This is because there is a separation that needs to happen between you and the people that raised you so that you can discover who you are without them. One of the best things that my wife and I ever did was to move away from Texas, where we were raised and where all of our family is, and we moved to Chicago. We did this fairly early on. We were in our mid-20s at the time. And we were in Chicago going to school for 3 years. And what was great about that, well, it wasn't the weather, I can tell you that for sure. Oh my gosh, it was cold. In fact, one morning, I was in another room getting ready, prepping schoolwork, and I heard Emily, my wife, she was in the other room, and she was getting ready to leave, and I heard her go, "Ah!" And I ran out because something really bad had happened. I said, "What's wrong?" She was putting on her snow boots. She was like, "I just can't take one more day of this cold. It's terrible." And that was it. That was her complaint. So later we moved to California. But we left our parents, and it meant that for the next several years, we had to figure out how to do life without that close safety net. That was really good for us, right? Now, they were still there if we needed to call, if we needed help, but we had to kind of figure out day in and day out, how are we managing our household? What are we doing here? How are we surviving? What jobs are we taking up? What does our friend network look like? What beliefs do we keep from childhood, and what evolves or changes or transforms? It was all that kind of stuff, and we didn't go into that experience thinking that that's what we would get out of it. Chicago just sounded like an adventure for two people who'd grown up close to Dallas, but what we found in moving to Chicago was ourselves. We found our own identities. And so this is, Jesus talks about this, the idea that a man and a woman will leave their parents behind and kind of adopt a new identity together if you get married, or an identity of your own if you don't. And so that's leaving your parents ends up being an important part of the first mountain. Cultivating your talents. What are the things you're good at? And what are the things you're interested in? And what does it look like to get better at those and to find other people to speak into them so that you can become better and better still? To build a secure ego. We're going to talk way more about this in just a little bit, but you need some kind of ego. That is not a bad thing to have an ego. In fact, it's a really bad thing not to have one at all. And then finally, to make your mark. To make your mark, to make a difference in the world. And look, let's be honest. In the first half of life, when you're climbing that first mountain, making your mark on the world is more about proving to yourself that you can do that, or proving to others that you can do that, than it is about actually making a positive change in the world. I'm not saying that everything you do is purely selfish. I'm just saying that most of what you do is purely selfish. Most of what we do starts from a selfish place. I want to prove to others that I can do it. I want to prove to others that I can handle it. Or I want to prove to myself that I can. In the first half of life, what we're looking to do is to continue to pad our ego, continue to pat ourselves on the back, continue to believe that we can make it on our own. By the way, if all of that sounds bad, it's not all bad. You have to start somewhere. You have to develop an ego before you can move beyond it. There's no way to get to the second mountain without climbing the first. I'm afraid that's just the way it works. So in the first half of life, David Brooke talks about it this way. The goals on that first mountain are the normal goals that our culture endorses: to be a success, to be well thought of, to get invited into the right social circles, and to experience personal happiness. It's all the normal stuff: nice home, nice family, nice vacations, good food, good friends, and so on. Now, this is not bad, especially the good food part. This is really, really not bad, okay? But if this is all you ever do, at some point, you will find that it's not enough. Either you'll climb to the top of the mountain, look around, and weep because there's no more mountain left to climb, or you'll get blown off the mountain by something that was out of your control, or maybe that was your fault, and suddenly your trajectory doesn't look like it's just going to be forever up and to the right. Or tragedy will strike your life, and it'll send you reeling to such a degree that you don't even care about this stuff anymore because you're just in survival mode. This is why celebrity after celebrity, wealthy person after wealthy person, it's such a common story. It's cliched at this point, right? I finally got there and I still wasn't happy. The Jim Carrey line I've used a couple times because I just think it's such a great encapsulation of this. I wish everybody could get everything they want in the world, he says, so that they would realize that's not the answer. People get to the top of the mountain and then they realize, oh, I'm still miserable. So that leads you to climb the second mountain. The second mountain is very different than the first, and it looks like this. First of all, it's a check on your ego. You just recognize it for what it is, and you're able to move beyond it. We'll talk way more about this in the weeks to come. Secondly, it's less materialistic. You're not so worried about making sure that other people think that you are winning the game of materialism. Third, it's others-oriented. It's not just about self, it's about other people. Fourth, it clashes with culture, right? If the culture is saying the way forward is wealth, fame, accomplishment, etc., then when you move into this, you'll be at odds with the culture. You'll just think about things differently. And finally, I've said this before recently, but I just want to keep hammering this home because I think this is so important. It's almost unoffendable. Like when you start to really climb that second mountain in life, you will find that you are very difficult to offend because of some of this other stuff. Less ego, more others-oriented. Now look, I am not at the top of the second mountain. I have started the climb for sure, and there are days where I feel like I am further up the mountain than others, and I haven't arrived, and I suspect I never will this side of eternity. So please when I say this, don't think like I think I have it all together. I have plenty of faults. I promise you, my family would be happy to agree with that. But I will say over the last 4 or 5 years, this almost unoffendable thing has become increasingly true of me. I'm just not as easily as offended as I once was. And other people having different opinions than me, or it doesn't feel like a threat anymore. Whereas there was a time in my life, decades, where when someone had a different idea than I did, or a different belief than I did, their difference of opinion felt like a threat to my own. Why? I can't fully explain that. It just did. And probably many of you know what I'm talking about. And so if someone came at me like, well, that's not the way I see it, I would immediately feel like, well, I have to show you why you're wrong, blah, right? There was that kind of feeling. But the higher up the second mountain you get, the less offendable you become, and the less you feel like, oh, I have to convince everyone that I'm right. It's more like, no, I'm here for the journey. I'm happy to share my experience, my thoughts. I'm happy to hear yours. And I'm happy to, you think about others more. I'm happy to, talk about this together as opposed to winning. That's part of what it looks like to climb that second mountain. Jesus said it like this when he talked about finding your life. Jesus says to his disciples, it's Matthew 16, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. This is the paradox that Jesus gives us. The harder you cling to life, the more it slips through your fingers. When you're willing to loosen up on that first mountain, on the stuff of ego and pride and identity and accomplishment, when you're willing to open your hands up, the more open you are, the more you're willing to lose for the sake of Christ, he says, the more life you will find. It doesn't feel like that could possibly be the case. And yet Jesus declares that it is. He goes on to even say this, what good will it be for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? Right? You could gain everything. You could gain the entire world, all the wealth, all the fame, all the power, all the sex. You could gain it all. And if you lose your soul, you'll still be miserable. That, Jesus says, is not a good life. So what I'm going to look at over the next several weeks is what it looks like to move mountains. How do you go from mountain number 1 to mountain number 2? Many of you are, there's so many online and here in the room and in the other services, there's a full spectrum at our church, I assure you, of people who are still at the very beginning of mountain number 1, people who have fallen off that mountain and have no idea where the mountains are, people who are starting on mountain 2, or people who are way farther ahead on mountain 2 than lots of, we're all over the place here, I assure you. But at whatever age you are now, whether you're either 22 or 82 or beyond, I'm not trying to exclude our 100-year-old people, wherever you are, it's not too late to take inventory of where you are and to look ahead to the journey that's possible. So what does it look like to move mountains, to go from mountain 1 to mountain 2? Well, I'm afraid that for everyone, it basically looks exactly the same. And we see this pattern over and over in the scriptures, and many of you have experienced it in your own life, and some of you are eyeballing it coming down the road. Very simple, and then I'll unpack it. It looks like this: order, disorder, reorder. Here's what I mean by this. Order. Someone hands you the order of things. You start to understand the world in a particular way. This starts in childhood. At some point, you start to push back against the things you were handed. Usually when you were a late teen, some of you, when you were early teens, you immediately started to be like, everyone else is probably wrong. I need to just figure this out for myself. And so disorder, you start to take it apart. You start to deconstruct. You start to question the narratives that you were handed. But then if you stay there, you're going to be in trouble. So you move to reorder. That's where you see the world differently than you did before. Or maybe you even believe many of the same things, but for different reasons than you once did. Order, disorder, reorder. That is always the pathway to move from the first half of life, the first mountain, to the second half of life, the second mountain. That's always the pathway. Let me give you one quick example just to kind of prove the rule, and then we'll move forward. The Apostle Paul In the book of Acts, we find out his story. He had grown up. He was a highly religious Jewish leader. He was in the Pharisees. He had ordered his life. He knew the exact way forward. He knew the rules. He started persecuting Christians, followers of Jesus, because they were following this person who they said God himself had taken up residence in a human being, which in his mind was heresy. These are the bad guys. So he persecuted. He oversaw their stoning. He oversaw their imprisonment. He was on his way to persecute more Christians when what happens? Jesus appears to him, and everything he assumed about the world completely fell apart. Order, disorder. You meet Jesus, disorder. Then he spends the rest of his life reordering the world that he thought he understood. That's the pattern. Order, disorder, reorder, and this is what we're going to talk about for the next 3 weeks. So this week we're going to talk about order, next week we'll talk about disorder, and then we'll talk about reorder, and then week 4 we'll talk about what it means to take all this and start to give your life away. That's how you get to live a good life. So order is very important. It's the first thing. So I'm going to tell you this week, if you tend to be a more conservative person, and I don't mean necessarily politically or theologically, you tend to be more of a conservative person, you're going to love this week. And I want you to remember that because you're not going to love next week, okay? So hang out with me this week. This week is for you. This week is going to affirm lots of the things that you think because you're right about so much. And in the next week, we'll talk about kind of the flip side of that, what it looks like on the backside. But let's talk about order. Richard Rohr, who I don't agree with on everything, but I find he's very wise about a lot of things. And he writes this. He says, there's much evidence on several levels that there are at least 2 major tasks to human life. The first task is to build a strong container or identity. The second is to find the contents that the container was meant to hold. In other words, when you are a child moving into young adulthood, you need to start to get a sense of yourself and a sense of the world. You need to create a container that has some rigidity to it. This is the order that you are handed, the way of making sense of the world. You'll figure out in the second half of life what to fill that container with, but in the first half of life, you're just trying to build something that can hold something. He goes on to say this, though. The first task we take for granted as the very purpose of life, which does not mean we do it well. The second task, I am told, is more encountered than sought. Few arrive at it with much pre-planning, purpose, or passion. So here's what he's saying. Many people confuse this first task of order as being the whole enchilada. It's just this. I just need to hold on and white knuckle the order I was handed as a young person, and I just need to always believe and think about world the same way. And anyone who thinks about it differently, I see as a threat to my own belief system, and I just either plug my ears or shout back at them or scream into the void and just keep moving forward. If you're constantly just working on the order part, just rebuilding it, you'll find along the way that it'll become less and less compelling to you the older you get. The second half of life is to call all of that into question. Is to fill the container you have with different content. But lots of people don't make it to that. So this is why I want to give you kind of the order. This is what it looks like to learn order early on. And here's what I want you to notice as we walk through this. Some of you were handed a very helpful version of order as kids and young adults, and some of you weren't. And whether you had that as your starting place or not, I just want you to know it's not hopeless for you. Any step along this journey from mountain 1 to mountain 2 that you haven't taken yet, you can always go back through the grace and mercy of Jesus and fix that, repair that, walk through that thing that you should have walked through earlier. So please know that as we walk through the kinds of order things that are helpful to hand to you when you're young, many of you, and I talked to 2 people after last service who would say, yeah, I wasn't handed that by my parents or my grandparents or my teachers. No one handed that to me. And I've been looking for it ever since. So I want to talk about the kind of order that's helpful to hand people as they're growing up so you can actually start that first mountain of life. Here's a few things. First of all, a religious tradition. A religious tradition. Why? Because religious traditions help us understand the world. They answer the big questions in life, like, why are we here? What is our purpose in life? What is the world all about? Do other people matter, or is it just selfish gain? They answer those kinds of questions. And so whether your religious tradition is Christianity or something like agnosticism or atheism, and I know people be like, those aren't religious traditions. They are. They're a set of beliefs about the very nature of the universe. That's what I mean by religious tradition. And so even if you believe, maybe your religious belief is, if it's not provable scientifically, then it doesn't exist, or it doesn't matter. And that is a religious belief, right? You can't actually prove that belief, that you believe it, and you would think you have good reasons for it, and other people would think they have good reasons to disagree. But that's kind of the way that you see the world or understand it. So whether you're atheist or Christian or Jewish or Muslim, there's a religious tradition that you're handed as a child, an understanding of the way that the world works that should have been handed to you. It orders the world. Secondly, morality, a sense of right and a sense of wrong. Probably when you were a kid, someone told you what was right and what was wrong. I am a father of 2 boys, and we are constantly talking about right and wrong. We have 2 major rules in our house. Other people pass these on to us. We thought they were great. We've talked about them with our kids. Number 1 is honor your mother, dad, whatever, but honor your mom, okay? Number 2, don't lie. Because trust is the most important thing we can have in these relationships. So don't tell a lie. Honor your mom, don't tell a lie. There's other little rules that we talk about along the way as well, right? Stop hitting your brother. Stop biting your brother. Please let the dog go. She doesn't like that. Stop pushing your brother toward the campfire. There's all kinds of rules that you start to work toward, right? But someone, hopefully when you were a kid, gave you some kind of understanding of right and wrong. We do this, we don't do that. And whether it was what you still hold to or not, like you just needed a starting place. Part of the beauty of all of this is it's just a starting place. It's a way to start understanding the world when you were very young. Third one, ego. You need some kind of ego. Hopefully when you were a child, someone told you that you were special. Now, as you get older in life, you start to realize there's caveats to that. How special is any one of us, right? There are billions of people on this planet. We all have different talents and different uses and different ways of thinking, all that kind of stuff. And so you can get older and start to think like kind of cynically like, well, nobody's special. I'm not special. You're not special. None of us are special, right? You can start to have that kind of mindset. But that is kind of like a pretty nuanced understanding of the fact that there are so many of us and like that, right? And there's a way in which it's true that no one is special. But according to the scripture, according to Jesus, who gave his life for each and every person, there's a way in which it's true that everybody is special. And when you're a kid, hopefully someone gave your non-nuanced thinking brain the idea that you were special and that you mattered. If they didn't, it's very likely that you will spend the rest of your adult life looking to try and get other people to tell you that you're special, to tell you that you matter, to validate you as a person. Many of us who don't receive that from our parents or grandparents or teachers growing up, we search for it the rest of our lives. Or instead of searching for it, we're just angry and bitter that no one ever gave it to us. And so we have a sneaking suspicion of everybody. Ego is not bad. At the beginning, you need a little bit of narcissism. You need to think that you're the center of the universe for just a little bit because you must have an ego in order to move past it. And if no one ever told you that you were special as a kid, I don't know how much it means for me as a pastor to tell you this, but according to the scripture, according to Jesus, you're special and you matter. And we need to know that. That's part of ordering our life. It's part of starting off in that first mountain. Another one, love of family. Why is this important? Look, in the second half of life, you may start to realize like what Jesus said. Jesus radically redefines family. He says your family isn't just your blood relatives. It's other people who follow after Jesus. That's who your true family is. Like he's constantly widening the circle, bringing other people in. In the second half of life, that's very important to understand as you're climbing that second mountain. But when you're very young, that's a really abstract concept. Like you can't grasp that. So the starting place is you should love your family. Why is that helpful? Because it's bigger than you. You need to work on your ego. You need to also know that there are other people that are worthy of my love outside of just me. And so it's, love your brother. Why? He won't let me play the Harry Potter game. Love your brother anyway because he's your brother. Because we just love each other. Even when we're different, there's a love that we have for each other. We care for each other. We're willing to sacrifice some ourselves in order to love one another well. We share with each other. We give what we have to one another. Like this is a really helpful thing to learn. Hopefully, you learn love of family early on in life. Not because it's the ultimate, like some people make family an idol, but because it's important. And it's the first time for many of us that we start to think outside of ourselves to something bigger. Beyond this, then, you have love of your city or your school or your country. And these are good things too, because again, you're widening the circle. You're building your own ego. You're loving your family. Okay, beyond that, you're going to love your city. Every city I've ever lived in just about has thought very highly of itself in some way, shape, or form. I grew up in a very small town called Grand Saline, Texas. It was about 2,000 people. We had one red light in town. A couple years after I left for college, they got a second red light, and you'd have thought they won the world lottery. Like, it was just like, look at us, we have 2 red lights now. It's very exciting. And you would think like, man, how are you proud of a town that small and that seemingly insignificant when you're growing up? Easy. There was a town called Fruitvale right down the road that only had 500 people and no red light, right? So those were the backwoods people. Those were the those were the country bumpkins down there. We were Grand Saline, proud and tall. Fruitvale people, blah. I don't even know who Fruitvale made fun of. Like, there was no other town smaller than them, right? I assume they all grew up with no ego and were dead by 40. I don't actually know. So it's probably not true. All right, so, but you have this love of city. I was in Pennsylvania, Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which was it's a really lovely town. But if you came in from the big city, you might feel like, oh, it's small and quaint or that kind of thing. But in Carlisle, we had Perry County, just over the mountains. That's where the mountain people live. They talked about them like we were just all starring in the movie Deliverance. Like, you better watch it. You go up there, you might get skinned alive. It was that kind of thing. Wasn't true, but you're always contrasting yourself with somebody else, right? Los Angeles thinks that they're more special than the Inland Empire. We're the Inland Empire, but at least we're more special than the high desert, right? Like, it just goes. Yeah, that, by the way, is true. That's true. So, this love of city, love of the people who you actually might meet in the grocery store or at the market or at the football game or whatever. Like, it's a good thing. It's a good thing. Because again, you're broadening the circle. You're thinking outside of yourself. This is good to be handed. Love of school. We had a pep rally Texas, right, is where I grew up. Football is a religion there. They don't think that it is, but it is. So every Friday before the football game, there would be a pep rally. All of the kids from the high school would gather in the gym, and they'd have this big pep rally. And it didn't matter if our team was great that year in going to the playoffs, or if we had not won a single game 6 games into the season. The pep rally was like, we're the best team, we're gonna crush the enemy and eat their bones. It was like that kind of approach, right? Was it true? No. It's what we said, it's what we told ourselves because we had pride in our school or your country. Patriotism can be good, it can be healthy. To say like, I live in a country with these other people, and therefore we have a lot of these shared experiences or a lot of these shared values. And so I'm for them, I'm rooting for them. The Olympic Games come on, like, yes, go Team USA, right? I mean, that can be really good. It can be really healthy. It can be very positive. Now, look, any of these things we realize as we get older can become extreme and unhelpful. They can become tribalistic in a way that says other people are bad or the enemy or we should be against them. That can happen. But when you're young, tribalism is actually a helpful starting place. It's when you cement yourself in it and can't get past it that it becomes very, very problematic. But at the beginning, you just need to be able to think a little bit outside of yourself, and then a little bit more, and then a little bit more. And hopefully when you were a kid, someone handed you the order of that kind of structure. Where they said, yeah, you're special. Your family is special. Your town, your school, your state, your country is special. That's a good thing to have. The virtue of hard work. This is something that, in the United States, we understand that hard work is good. We also, as we get older, start to understand the limits of its benefit. In other words, like we have kind of the American story, right? Every country, I think, has a mythology or a story that they tell themselves. And one of the American stories that we tell is of the person who started from the very bottom, but they pulled themselves up by their own bootstraps, and they worked really hard, and they were smarter and harder working than everybody else, and they went and they made their fortune, and they climbed the whole ladder. And we have lots of stories of that. Tons of politicians run on that exact story, right? I was the son of immigrants, and we had nothing, and then I did this, and then I did that, and now I'm here, and now I represent you in Congress, and half of you hate me because half of you hate every politician. So it's that kind of story, right? You just kind of go through. That's the American myth, and lots of people do live that story. Now, as you get older, you realize there are some people who reach down to pull up their bootstraps only to find they don't have any straps on their boots. That not everybody can pull themselves up. That actually, for all of us, there's a sense in which much of what we accomplish in life is owed to somebody else. There are other people who pour into our lives. It's more complicated, in other words, than just the American mythology. But that's a second half of life, second mountain, more nuanced understanding. In the beginning, the order that you are handed that can be very helpful is, hey, you know what? If you work hard, it'll pay off. It'll pay off. If you work hard, it'll help you and it'll help other people. So these are the kinds of things, and this is not an exhaustive list, but these are the kinds of things that many of us were or should have been handed at the beginning of life. Why? Because this is order. This says like, oh, okay, like this makes sense. This is order. This is a good foundation. Now, eventually, we'll disorder, right? We'll start to push back. We'll start to wonder, like, is that true? Or is that overly simplistic? We'll push back against it, and our life will be a bit disordered for a while before we can reorder it into a new understanding. But you have to start somewhere, and you have to start with order. Here's the question. Because for the last 40, 50 years, the dominant philosophical narrative in the United States has been that of postmodernism. Now, postmodernism has a lot it can teach us. So this is not a sermon that's like, postmodernism bad. Like, there's a lot of great things that are helpful about postmodern philosophy. But postmodernism is by its nature a philosophy of disorder. It's constantly questioning values that we've already held. It's deconstructing. It's saying, like, is that true, though? Like, what's the greater meaning behind it? And how do you think about that differently depending on where you were born and what your privilege is and your socioeconomic status and your ethnicity and all that kind of stuff? Postmodernism is constantly taking stuff apart. That can be very, very helpful. But that means that our culture, for the most part, has been characterized by disorder, which means if you were born after about 1965, 1968, the culture you were born into has been one of disorder. So what happens when you're born into disorder? Well, for many of us, we're never handed the order that we need to start our life so that we can then work ourselves toward disorder. So I'm just going to go back a couple slides. This last one, again, this wasn't exhaustive, but take a look at this. And just think for yourself, what of these things, and I'm sure you could think of others that could go on this list as well, what of these things were you not handed as a child or as a young adult that you wish you would have been? Not that you would have always believed that way, held it in that same way, but that you didn't even get a starting place. Now, some of us were very privileged to have had parents or grandparents or teachers that gave us a version, at least, of all this stuff. But for many of us, I suspect we look back and recognize that there were one or more of these things that were missing, that we've now spent a good chunk of our time climbing that first mountain trying to find. The good news is, if you weren't handed this stuff as a starting place, you can still grapple with it later on in life. It's not like over for you. It's not like, oh, I can never move toward disorder because I didn't receive order. No, you can still install the order. In fact, that's part of the beauty of a church community, is that we have people gathered here in our congregation from all different kinds of backgrounds and experiences. They were handed all different versions of order growing up. And this is a place, and these people are people who can help you to reclaim what you should have been handed in the first place. Because the alternative is worse. The alternative is Peter Pan. When I was a kid, I loved the Disney Peter Pan movie because I was a kid, and he was a kid, and he was forever a kid, and I was like, yeah, kids forever. I thought that would be amazing. And then I got older, and I was like, actually, I'd like to have more freedom than this. I'd really like to leave the house at some point, right? And this is a natural thing that happens. It's good. It's good. You learn more about the world. You learn more about what you like to do. When I was probably in middle school, having watched the Peter Pan movie numbers of times, I actually read the book that it was based on. And the book was way darker than the movie was, okay? Disney super Disney-fied the film. In the book, you get the feeling that growing up is like a death sentence. Like it's just the worst thing that could ever happen. To such a degree that you start to wonder if the author of the book himself regretted having grown up. There's even in pop psychology today a phrase that they use called Peter Pan syndrome, and it pulls on some of the work that Carl Jung did back in the early 20th century, but essentially says like there are people who never leave home, whether they move out of the house or not, they are still attached to their mother or to their father or to both in such a way that they never actually find their own identity. There are people who never quite get that sense of right and wrong. They live in a perpetual state of adolescent emotional attachment. It's Peter Pan syndrome. And if you weren't handed order as a foundation to launch your life off of, there's a decent chance that you have struggled all of your life to find the thing that should have been given to you early. And this is important, that's not your fault. It's not your fault. Years ago, there was a very famous pastor who wrote several New York Times bestsellers and traveled around the country filling up stadiums. I mean, this guy filled up Yankee Stadium just a few years ago in a city that's not known to be highly Christian. And I was trying to understand why he was so popular, because I would listen to his messages, and I felt like he was just saying the most obvious, banal stuff you could possibly imagine, but people were lapping it up. Like, he would show, he was on television a lot, and he would show him in his nice suit, and he would be preaching to people, and he would say things like this. He would say things like, I want you to know that you can do it. You can do it. And they would pan back to the crowd, and the crowd was furiously taking notes. I'm like, what are you writing down? Are you writing down the words, you can do it? Because I'm pretty sure that was a line from like an Adam Sandler movie, The Waterboy, 25 years ago, and that's what you wrote down? Or he would say something like, you can get a job. Pan to the people, oh, I can get a job, right? I was just like, what is happening here? Or he would say things like, you'll never know how much your smile can light up a room. And I'm like, why are people eating this up? It took me years to realize through pastoral counseling I did that millions and millions of people never had a parent in their life that told them, you can do it. I believe in you. You matter. Man, when you walk into a room and you smile, it lights the place up. Millions of people never had a mom or a dad that let them win at a card game even though they shouldn't have been good enough to do it. And what I realized was the draw for this pastor is that he was reparenting an entire generation that was never given the foundational starting place of order in their lives. Here's the good news. If that's you, it's not too late. Jesus invites you to build your life on his teachings and his worldview and his view of who you are. He says those who do that are like the wise man that built his house on rock, and those who don't are like the foolish man who built their house on the sand. He invites you to build your order on his teaching and on his life. And in doing so, here's what it does. It solves your problem of ego. It solves your problem of feeling like you need to be special, because you're so special that Jesus was willing to go an infinite distance to give his life for you. Why? So that you could have a good and fulfilling life. That's how much he cared about you. That's how much you matter. So if you were never handed the order that you needed to climb that first mountain well, I'm so sorry. It's not your fault. But I want to invite you to find the order that you should have received earlier in the person of Jesus. Because a good life starts with Jesus. Next week, we're going to take a look at disorder. What does it look like when the things that you were handed turn out to be maybe not complete? What does it look like when the thing you never thought would happen to you happens to you? And then we'll look at reordering all of that in the week after and giving it all away in the week after that. And I hope you'll come back every week so that we can discuss what it looks like to live the good life. When you walked in today, you should have been handed one of these. It says a little cracker in it and some juice. And we're going to join today millions of people around the world who participate in a tradition, a sacrament that's called the Lord's Supper or Communion or the Eucharist. And what it does is it reminds us, and it also spurs us on. So it reminds us that Jesus gave his life for us. And today, as we think about how you are special because of that fact, this is a good day to remember what he did. On the night that he would be arrested and then eventually experience a trial and eventually a crucifixion, he gathered his followers in a room together. And he told them what was about to happen. He was about to give up his life so that they could find their own life. I mean, that matters so much to us. We have it as our mission statement here at vervecity.church, that our mission is to inspire people to find life by following Jesus. He's going to give up his life so that you can find yours. And he said to them that this bread that he broke and he passed out to them, it represents his body broken for you, that you could find life by him giving his life away. Take and eat, he said, in remembrance of me. In the same way, he took the cup, and he told them that this represented his blood. It was poured out for the remission of sin. Whatever you experienced in your life that messed your life up or that broke you or that hurt you, whatever you've done to others that broke them or hurt them, those regrets that you have, it's like, I'm pouring my blood out so that I can rid you of all of that guilt and shame and that you can have relationship with God. And he told them, take this cup and drink in remembrance of me. Father, thank you for the goodness of Jesus. Thank you, Lord, that whether or not we were handed the order that we deserved as a kid, and that starting place to climb that first mountain, Lord, that Jesus provides it for us now. God, may we find life in him. May we find order in him. May we find significance and purpose in him. Lord, thank you that you loved us so much. You went an infinite distance for us. And I just pray for every wound that is represented in this room by people who weren't handed the childhood they should have been or the order that they should have been. Lord, may you start to heal those wounds today through the death and through the resurrection, through the teachings of the glorious name of Jesus. And it is that name that we pray. Amen.